these fascinating panels and presentations. So yeah, we're incredibly grateful. Um, so our final event for the day is um, uh, a keynote lecture by Professor Shenila Khoja-Moolji, who has been kind and gracious enough to accept our invitation, and was one of the first people we contacted when we had this idea for the symposium, and has been extremely supportive throughout. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we kind of sort of go on with her with with the lecture, I just kind of want to do a brief introduction. So Professor Khoja-Moolji's talk today itself is titled Recuperation and Repair, Learning from the Writings of Muslim Women. And Professor Khoja-Moolji is the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Associate Professor of Muslim Societies at Georgetown University. She is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersections of gender, Islam, and South Asian studies, and the author of two award-winning books. Her keynote, her research interests include Muslim girlhoods, masculinities, sovereignty, and Ismaili Muslim women's history. She investigates these topics empirically in relation to Muslims in South Asia and in the North American diaspora. Khoja-Moolji is the author of two award-winning books titled Forging the Ideal Educated Girl, The Production of Desirable Subjects in Muslim South Asia, and Sovereign Attachments, Masculinity, Muslimness, and Affective Politics in Pakistan. She is currently working on a book that traces the transnational lives of displaced Shia Ismaili Muslim women. Her articles have appeared in Science, Feminist Theory, and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, among other reputed journals. We're delighted to have you with us, Professor Khoja-Moolji. And before you start, just want to let everyone know that we have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I'm assuming that Shania will speak for about like 30-ish minutes or 40 minutes maybe. And after that, we'll have Q&As. You're welcome, of course, to post questions in the chat or just raise your hands at the end during the Q&A session to ask any questions. Yeah, please keep your mic switched off unless you're speaking. But otherwise, we can get started. So yeah, Professor, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and salam. This is such an important space that the collective has created. So I wanted to begin by first acknowledging the labor that it takes to not only conceptualize a space to think about Muslim women's writings, but then to bring together all of these speakers, to go through the abstracts, create a program, and then as Zehra said, you have to kind of invest these 3 days, just, manually, physically being here and managing all the organizational and technical aspects. I have been in touch with the collective for, I want to say, like months. And so this is not an endeavor that was put together quickly. It has been in the making for such a long time. And so I wanted to first not only appreciate, but also acknowledge the labor of women today who are trying to excavate and recover the lives of women past and the writings about Muslim women. And so there's an ethic of care that is it's tangibly manifest in your work. And I think that's really important for us to also acknowledge that and thank you for it. I don't think that there have been many occasions that have been focused on Muslim women in South Asia. So this might actually be a pioneering first conversation that we're having. And what is also really delightful to see is that there's so many people who are working on this topic. And so you've kind of brought together a community of scholars who can now network as well. And so thank you for that. My contribution will be small, but I will try to take the next 30 minutes or so to share some recent work that builds off of my first book, but to also kind of point to the Muslim in the title of this conference, to then ask larger questions around what does it mean for us to think about the lives of Muslim women? How do we even also conceptualize Islam? And within that broader pattern, the text that I will share today is about the life of a Shia Muslim woman. She belongs to the elite Muslim social class, Ashraf women that we often encounter. And so you will see systematicities and continuities in that experience, but paying attention to Shia women also gives us insights into different kinds of life worlds because their religious practices might be different, right? And so it's with that it's with that objective that I selected this particular text. So let me begin by sharing my screen. And I'm on a different institutional computer, so I will keep asking you if you can actually see my stuff.
Have you started sharing already?
Let me see. I'll try one more time. I'll let you know when I have, I think.
You're also just welcome to send us a quick email on the Tasavvur ID, and I'm happy to present it for you if you'd like that.
Okay, so I think, let's see. Let me just, I'm so sorry. This is the first time I'm presenting on this. So let me just email it to you. I think that might be easiest.
It's also just like classic screen sharing issues. We've encountered them multiple times throughout the conference. It's really not a big deal at all.
Oh, okay, awesome. So let me just do this.
Can I ask you which email address you sent it on? Is it the Tasavvur Gmail?
Yes, let me, it's taking a while to upload. Okay. So I've sent it now. And I don't need the PowerPoint as much, so I'll just begin if you don't mind.
Yeah, you can start, and I'll just start screen sharing once I get the email. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And so, as I said, I wanted to first acknowledge the Tasavvur Collective. And I also wanted to note that this recuperative effort is so important for bringing women into presence, but also for accounting their contributions to the making of Muslim socialities. At the same time, our engagement with women's writings cannot stop with recovery. We also look to the work of women to discover new ways of theorizing our contemporary condition and for imagining preferred futures. And so it's with this perspective that I share my discovery of a late 19th century text that I discovered in Lahore during my field work for my first book. So at the time, I was writing about notions of girlhood and education as they appeared in the writings of Muslim women, particularly in the turn of the 20th century magazines, women's magazines. I had spent over 2 months in the basement of the Punjab Public Library. The librarian, whom I had come to call uncle because of his advanced age, he had directed me to hordes of books, uncatalogued and getting dust, and they were gathering dust, saying that beta wahan dekh lo, when I had asked him for women's magazines. In that basement, I learned about a woman called Muhammadi Begum, who not only wrote several short stories, but also was the first female editor of a magazine, Tehzeeb-e-Niswan, established in 1898. And I think a couple of other speakers in the conference have spoken about that magazine as well. Her husband had a small printing press, and that is how she had come to publish her magazine and numerous stories. So I wondered about her class privilege, and I also remember giggling when reading her writings that criticized the British. Muhammadi Begum died in 1908 at a young age of 30. I was in my early 30s when I was reading her work. So I wondered what Lahore must have been like a century earlier when she lived there. Once when I was in a rickshaw trying to get to the library, it got stuck because the driver could not see the Nala. Oh, I see that you have, okay. So we are on slide 2 right now.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And so Once I got stuck, as I was mentioning, in the rickshaw because there was an open nala, and I pondered the materiality of writing. How did she travel? Who did she work with at the printing press? Who helped her mail all those letters and correspondences? What was it like to read, write, and edit at the same time? Why did she do all this labor? What politics was she trying to advance through her writing? Towards the end of my field work, as I was getting ready to say goodbye to the librarian uncle, I noticed a pile in the corner. Quite frankly, I was really tired by that time, and I was just going to leave when I saw Muhammadi Begum's name from the corner of my eye. I felt obligated to stop and browse the text, and what a find it was. Next slide, please. So my encounter with Hayat-e-Ashraf, the life of Ashraf an-Nisa, was a happy accident. Hayat-e-Ashraf tells us about the writerly lives of not only one, but three women. The central character, Ashraf an-Nisa, who died in 1903, the editor or compiler, Muhammadi Begum herself, as well as Bibi Ashraf's daughter, Jafri Begum, whose writings too are featured in this text. So I focused my keynote on this text by way of reanimating the lives of women past. And in the process, we will uncover answers to some of the questions I first had when my rickshaw got stuck in Lahore. Next slide, please. At this point in the symposium, we all know well that when Muslim women appear in official national and colonial archives, they appear as objects in men's worlds, objects of men's reforms, tropes in the writings of men, bodies that carry men's honor and shame. To subvert these portrayals, feminist scholars have called for excavating women's autobiographical texts to amplify alternate subjectivities of women. Indeed, women of color have used the autobiographical genre to talk back to constructions of permanent vulnerability, and hence scholars note that such texts are an important and yet under-theorized area of feminist resistance. But women did not write in the styles and genres that men often wrote in. To uncover women's worlds, we have to move into everyday writings that include letters, diaries, recipes, embroidery, pamphlets, devotional literature, like the presentations on the Ginan that we saw earlier today, marsias, and short stories. In particular, women did not have the social capital required to produce that which was or is constituted as autobiography. Feminist scholars, including Siobhan Lambert-Hurley, who was a speaker at the symposium, they have called for extending the definition of autobiography to include letters, novels, reformist literatures, interviews, and diaries. In my book, therefore, I analyzed a range of women's periodicals to discover broad patterns about their approach to education and their construction of ideal girlhood. That, however, was the world of elite Sunni Muslim women. In contrast, Hayat-e-Ashraf gives us a peek into the world of an elite Shia woman. We see similarities and differences, but what is most interesting is the fact that Ashraf Bibi's class positioning becomes a bit precarious during the course of her life because her husband dies young. So unlike other elite women who would not even think of working outside the home for wages, she does step out into the world of commerce. In the text, then, we encounter a story of a woman navigating the expectations and aesthetics of her social class and norms around respectability. We also discover rich religious life worlds of Shia women and how devotional literature, marsias, for example, that they encounter in the Shia majalis become a pathway for further literacy. And that point, taking seriously the Islam practiced by women, is, I think, really an important contribution of this symposium as well. Hayat-e-Ashraf was compiled by Muhammadi Begum, and it was published in 1899 in Tehzeeb-e-Niswan in 2 installments. The text includes not only Muhammadi Begum's account of Ashraf an-Nisa's life, but also articles written by Ashraf an-Nisa herself and letters written by her daughter. And so it bears the imprint of 3 different women. I therefore theorized the text as a palimpsest, layered with multiple performances of educated selves. Golding, Walter, and Friedrich take up the ancient practice of palimpsesting and apply it to contemporary texts as a way to glean multiple meanings. This practice can be traced back to the 7th and 9th centuries, when, due to lack of writing materials, scholars erased ink from papyrus pages to inscribe new text. Later, archivists would seek to recuperate classical text that lay underneath the new text. Drawing on this practice, I too examine the productivity of this concept in relation to Muslim women's text. Here, I employ the term not in the usual sense of the materiality of manuscripts, but in the discursive sense of multiple performances of selves that are overlaid in Hayat-e-Ashraf. So we see the letters that are included, that are written by Bibi Ashraf and her daughter. We see the interpretive lens of Muhammadi Begum, who then advances it into the form of a text so that it's didactic in a particular way. So it tells us about her own politics. And then our approach to the text, right? We're also coming to it with a specific objective and a reading practice. And so it provides us, and in particular, as I think about it, I also think about it as a Muslim woman. This technique is particularly useful in engaging autobiographies, which are the work of memory and necessarily manufactured. I do not take these texts to represent essential truths about the characters they depict, but they certainly represent the biographer's efforts to memorialize lives and ideas. They invite us readers, in turn, to construct our own interpretations. Sylvia Vertuk, also a speaker at the symposium, provides some direction for examining such texts. She explains that in examining an autobiography, one must attend to the specific personal, social, and historical context within which the author was motivated to create it, discover its intended audience, and determine the nature of relationships among audience, author, and subject at the time it was produced. Enacting this method entails attending not only to the internal references of a text, but also placing it in longer histories of articulation, as well as exploring the knowledges that it draws upon. This means that both the textual and contextual dimensions of a representation are foregrounded. Next slide, please. So I will share 3 storylines from Hayat-e-Ashraf, which respond to specific questions. First, we will learn about Bibi Ashraf's effort to learn reading and writing. Second, we will learn about women's lives in the homosocial spaces of Maktab and Shia Majalis. And third, we will discover Muhammadi Begum's, the author's, politics. Next slide, please. So Bibi Ashraf was born in 1840 in a Shia Muslim family in Banera. She informs us that girls in her Biradri were taught to read for a long time, although teaching of writing had been opposed. Her own mother knew how to read the Quran and Urdu books, and it was expected that she too would obtain such an education. Her grandfather had hired a female teacher for 10 rupees per month plus food and clothing. The teachers taught the 6 girls in Bibi Ashraf's household, but over time, 20 to 25 girls from the neighborhood joined. It became a kind of maktab, she says. In addition to reading the Quran, the girls learned how to cook and sew. The teacher, who was also of a similar social status, being a Sharif Pathan herself, however, did not know Urdu language. And even after searching for an Urdu teacher, one could not be found. Bibi Ashraf's account of her learning can be placed alongside other accounts of such spaces of learning that were increasingly being arranged for Muslim girls from Sharif families by either other women or their male relations. In Nazir Ahmad's Mirat al-Urus, we find evidence of Askari organizing a madrasa for girls at her home. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, Sharif women's education was a topic of discussion among male social reformers. Sharif literally means respectable, but in late 19th century, it signaled foreign ancestry or affiliation with the Mughal court. Bibi Ashraf's family, for instance, traced ancestors to Bukhara in Central Asia, and her male relations had served under various Mughal rulers. The period under consideration is marked by increasing anxiety on the part of such Sharif families who had previously enjoyed privileges in the Mughal courts, but after the entrenchment of the British rule, they were now struggling to preserve their social status. So social status or social class had to be redefined. So it had to be detached from ancestry, and women and their practices emerged as prominent discursive spaces in and through which religious reformers, modernists, nationalists, and even women themselves signaled their class or respectable status. And therefore, during this time, we find competing notions of appropriate knowledges and educative spaces for Sharif women. During the meetings of the All India Mohammedan Education Conference, a forum established by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in 1886, some Muslim reformers proposed that a more concerted effort should be made to establish institutions for women's education. In the third annual conference and the third sort of annual meeting of the conference, it was resolved that Muslims would set up Zanana Maktab. While Sir Syed did not approve of such proposals, after his death, a number of leaders in the conference marked it as a priority. The conference passed a resolution for setting up a girls' school in every capital of every province and called for preparing appropriate books for Muslim girls' education. The 1905 conference was another key platform where different visions for women's education were debated and discussed. Here, a major proposal was the establishment of a boarding school for girls. In his presidential address at the conference, Mumtazul Mulk noted that various groups had divergent preferences for how girls should be educated, and he called on attendees to work on these multiple pathways. Those who were willing to give education privately should do so, and those who could create madrasas should do so as well. And so we see here a recognition and acceptance of multiple points of view within Ashraf families on this issue. And these preferences also reflected their social class interests as well. Bibi Ashraf's account then provides us a personalized narrative of one family's efforts to grow. And so other institutional conversations that Muslim social reformers were having, discovering these individual, personal, specific life stories helps us gain more texture around what happened on the ground. What were some of the contestations, negotiations, and how did women navigate some of these constraints and opportunities that are emerging at this turn of the century? So returning to her case, soon Bibi Ashraf's teacher, the Pathan teacher that I was speaking about, she was remarried, but since widow remarriage was not viewed favorably in Sharif households at the time, the teacher's move was read as a personal insult by Bibi Ashraf's grandfather. He was no longer willing to admit the teacher into his household. Bibi Ashraf and the other girls thus were left without a teacher. Bibi Ashraf recalls that many of the girls then continued to learn from their mothers. Her own mother, however, fell sick and passed away soon. Bibi Ashraf says, "My mother was more sad about my not being able to study than her own sickness." So this sentiment again points to the desire for learning that women of different generations seemed to have, and the ability of older women to teach younger ones. In fact, Bibi Ashraf's mother was a Marsi Akhwan, a reciter of Shia elegies that commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad. And so it points to Shia women's rich oral literary cultures as well. While there were many positive role models in Bibi Ashraf's life who urged her to read and write, we also encounter others, such as her uncle and aunt, as well as other ladies, that's what she calls them, who discouraged her. It is precisely due to this reason that she had to devise creative ways to continue her study. And this time it was aimed at learning the Urdu language. Bibi Ashraf decided to obtain devotional texts from her relatives, and she used to sneak up to the roof during the afternoon when others were sleeping to copy the text. She creatively used everyday materials such as grill ash to produce ink, and the lid of a water pot as a container for the ink, and twigs from the broom to write with. She tricked her grandmother into securing paper for her. Bibi Ashraf was delighted to be able to copy these texts. However, she could not read what she wrote. That is when she encountered a teacher in the most unexpected of circumstances. A young male relative once asked her to help him with Quran lessons. While helping him, she found out that he knew the Urdu language and asked him to teach her. He refused, noting that he would not have the time and she wouldn't understand the book anyway. And so Bibi Ashraf threatened him, "If you don't teach me, I won't teach you either." And so this convinced the cousin, who then began teaching her Urdu. He was, however, soon sent off to Delhi to study, but Bibi Ashraf persisted and completed that book on her own. She became so adept at Urdu that other women asked her to write letters on their behalf. During the 1857 war, her father, who worked in Delhi, could neither visit the family nor write to them for about a year and a half. When peace was restored, her grandmother asked her uncle to write a letter on their behalf. Bibi Ashraf also wrote a letter to him. Upon reading the letter, her father was so pleased that he basically said the letter gave him the pleasure of reading a newspaper and history. I read it once every day. Needless to add, Bibi Ashraf's paternal uncle was not happy about it. So what's critical again here to note is the specificity of family relations and different kinds of reactions to Bibi Ashraf's reading and writing. On one hand, we have figures like the mother, the grandmother, the father, and the grandfather who encouraged her to varying degrees. And on the other hand are the paternal uncle and aunt who did not. These specific circumstances push against sweeping generalizations about disapproval of Muslim women's learning by their families, an assumption that continues to circulate even today. This does not mean that women did not have difficulties. Bibi Ashraf's still was a patriarchal context where boys had much more opportunity. Her father was educated and worked as a lawyer. Later, we learned that her husband was afforded an education at the Delhi College. Even the young cousin who taught her Urdu was sent off to Delhi for education. So over time, such supports would formalize in the form of public schools and other institutional endeavors for girls as well. Next slide, please. Let me now turn to how women experience the Zanana. As I noted earlier, the text includes some letters and poems written by Bibi Ashraf's daughter, Jafari Begum. One poem stood out to me. It was written upon the conclusion of Jafari's time at the madrasa, and it gives us a glimpse into not only the kinds of activities that women undertook, but also the sense of solidarity that they experienced in such environments. I have written much more about this letter in the publication, so I'll just talk a little bit about some of the points that stood out. So in the poem, Jafari Begum calls her classmates Hamjoliyan and Behne. She tells us about the different activities that they undertook, from poring over maps and copying text to learning how to cook and sew. We get a sense of intense friendship among girls. Whenever Jafari Begum had to take time off from madrasa, other girls complained that the place felt sunsan. Similarly, Bibi Ashraf knows how her eagerness to learn Urdu was a result of a time she spent in the Zanana spaces. As a young girl, she observed older women read aloud from books during a majalis that was held every Thursday and during the month of Muharram. Again, we're looking at how women's religious practice is influencing a younger woman's desire to learn here. And so her desire to learn Urdu was sparked during such Shia majalis. In fact, it was also women from this very majalis who lent her devotional text literatures that she used to take up to the roof. She would sneak them up and copy, that we talked about earlier. So women's only spaces such as the home-based maktab and majalis appear as crucial spaces for them to both connect with other women and to access resources. However, during the turn of the 20th century, such spaces and the Zanana in general came under suspicion. They were marked as spaces of frivolousness, corruption, superstition, and backwardness by both Muslim male reformers, as well as the colonizers and Christian missionaries. Barbara Ramiasak observes that since the British did not have direct access to the Zanana or women's quarters, they were particularly anxious to reduce the influence of Indian women, whom they stereotyped as superstitious and of doubtful morality. Likewise, Muslim male reformers such as Ashraf Ali Thanwi, while advocating the practices of seclusion and parda, sought to thoroughly reform women's lives inside the Zanana. Thanwi's didactic text, Bahashti Zehra, aims to govern all aspects of women's lives. The text instructs women in religious rituals, duties, laws, etiquette, and proper gender relations, among other things. Reforming women's practices inside the zananas was thus a crucial part of the broader project of renewing the ulama's authority. Against such forms of controls, excavating scenes from Hayat-e-Ashraf that show a different affective resonance of zanana spaces can be very empowering. Next slide, please. So in the final storyline, I want to note that while Hayat-e-Ashraf is about Bibi Ashraf, it also tells us much about Muhammadi Begum's efforts and her politics. Like many other Sharif girls, Muhammadi Begum was educated at her home. She continued her learning after marriage. Her husband arranged for a teacher to teach her English, and she learned mathematics and Hindi from a boy in the neighborhood. She was dedicated to her work as the editor of Tehzeeb and Asman, including sometimes editing the magazine and answering letters from readers until 1 a.m. in the morning. In addition to the magazine, Muhammadi Begum penned several short stories which were of didactic nature, and they were especially aimed at girls. And I write a lot about Muhammadi Begum in my book, if you're interested. So we can suspect that the different accounts of Bibi Ashraf's life that are presented in Hayat-e-Ashraf are aspects that Muhammadi Begum deemed worthy of emulation. On one occasion, Muhammadi Begum notes, "Every sister should follow in her, Bibi Ashraf's footsteps. Therefore, I will provide a brief sketch of her ethics." Her selection of Bibi Ashraf's life events, therefore, gives us a glimpse into what women were concerned with at that particular historical conjuncture. One of the key storylines in the text is about Bibi Ashraf's ability to secure an income and live a Sharif life by drawing on her education and hunar, while not compromising on the customs of parda or the requirement for domestic management. Bibi Ashraf's economic independence appears all the more important since her husband passed away relatively early on, and she had to provide for herself, her children, as well as 4 to 5 young relatives who were part of her household. So early on, Bibi Ashraf drew on her skills of sewing to sustain herself and her household. She used to do lace work, and she used to sell that lace work. Later, she took up teaching at Victoria Girls' School. She eventually became the head teacher and continued to work there until her death. So Muhammadi Begum allocates significant space in the text to note that even though Bibi Ashraf worked in a school, she did not compromise on the practice of parda, which was considered a key marker of respectability. And so we're at this cusp where these negotiations are taking place. What is possible? What can be constituted as respectable? And so Muhammadi Begum is investing a lot of time in arguing that, look, while Bibi Ashraf is entering the world of commerce, she's not compromising on parda, which is a key marker of respectability for her social class. And so she further notes that Bibi Ashraf even advised her students to maintain parda and ensured the proper arrangement of parda were made for her students in the classrooms, as well as during pickup and drop off. So she arranged a doli for girls to come from their homes to the school and then from the school back home. And because of that reason, because of these concessions, the enrollment of Sharif girls increased in her particular school. And so again, we see this commitment to maintaining this class practice. In the text, we also find recurring mentions of Bibi Ashraf's devotion to her Shia faith. She organized majalis every Muharram, was regular in the practice of fasting and praying, and distributed food to poor women. And on top of all of this, Ashraf Bibi was also an excellent domestic manager. She ensured that she was not living beyond her means, and she kept a clean household. So these are the areas that Muhammadi Begum chooses to highlight: the practice of parda, widow remarriage, religious practices, and khanadari. These are points of intense debate and discussion during that time. Sharif families were concerned about the changes that education might bring to the lives of their women folk. Through Hayat-e-Ashraf, then, Muhammadi Begum articulates her own position on these issues, giving other women material for argumentation as well. In Bibi Ashraf, we see a woman who obtained education but did not become corrupt, who entered wage work but did not compromise the practice of parda. She did not compromise on khanadari and continued to host Shia majalis. We thus glean the political argument that that Muhammadi Begum was trying to make as well. So in terms of concluding thoughts, an examination of Hayat-e-Ashraf presents us with crucial evidence that disturbs the dominant logic about Muslim women's silence at the turn of the 20th century. Here we learn about the existence of maktabs where girls read voraciously and the creative and agentic maneuvers of one girl in particular, Ashraf an-Nisa, to educate herself. So the institutional narrative of reforms is complemented by the discovery of such personal specific stories. We discover supportive as well as unsupportive family members and relatives, and get a sense of the sadness that girls experienced upon completion of their madrasa education. We uncover the valiant efforts of a Muslim woman to produce didactic text for other Muslim women and girls, and of a woman who sets out to find waged work against social norms. We also discover the role of religious life forms, the majalis, the devotional texts, and what the role that they played in the lives of women. While for some, these remained largely oral texts, others, such as Bibi Ashraf, they inspired them to pursue reading and writing. Hayat-e-Ashraf then travels across temporalities to continue to teach lessons about Muslim subjectivities. My analysis of the text, however, is not meant to represent all Muslim women of the past. That would be yet another colonizing move. Ashraf an-Nisa's text is necessarily specific, informed by her elite positionality. Indeed, what this analysis offers is clues about ongoing efforts of a particular social class of Muslims as they were confronting an entrenching and encroaching British Raj. It is part of their broader efforts of creating new avenues to secure their social and economic well-being. It showcases both the opportunities and limitations that women encountered and features the sheer ambition, negotiation, and tactics of some. It is precisely by acknowledging the specificity of the text and those portrayed in it that we can call for similar attention to specificity in the present as well, and in doing so resist essentialized portrayals of Muslim women today. Furthermore, an examination of Hayat-e-Ashraf restores Muslim women of the past and violates common sense understandings about their life. Indeed, Josephine MacDonald notes that a palimpsest both erases and retains the past and disrupts a sense of temporality. And the kind of history facilitated by its retentive memory is at once restorative and violating. But we're able to recover more. We're able to learn about homosocial spaces where women found joy and learned together. We see how women, albeit within a particular social class, helped and supported each other to navigate patriarchal norms. We learn about colonial and nationalist politics in relation to women's education. We're able to form interpretation about what the loss and transmutation of women's only spaces does for women's well-being later on. And so the discovery of this text is a boon. At the same time, these texts are also reminders about the heterogeneity of Muslim women. For example, they do not represent the life of my great-grandmother, who grew up about the same time as Bibi Ashraf, but in an impoverished household in Junagadh. She could not read or write. Her family was first displaced due to famines and epidemics in Gujarat at the turn of the 20th century, and then due to the 1947 partition of India, and then the 1971 war between East and West Pakistan. The lives of women like her must be recovered too. And for that, we may have to look for alternate forms of writings and memory, including oral histories, which is, inshallah, the topic of my forthcoming book. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor Khoja-Moolji, for that talk. It's really, amazing to see how you have, through very fine, granular, close reading, examined how the concept of sharafat and how was made and unmade by the women, sort of participating passively or actively in that process. And it's genuinely really, really interesting work. And I had to read your book anyway for my thesis while I was when I started working on it, and it's an illuminating sort of piece of work that informs so much of not just my own work, but I'm sure so many of the scholars who are attending this symposium, their work as well. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you,
I
Amanda.
I am happy to sort of open the floor for any questions if people want to raise their hand and sort of jump in, or use the chat feature. Okay, great. We have one already. I have some questions as well, but I can keep them towards the end and kind of focus on the participants first. So great. Yasmin, please go ahead.
Thank you. Professor Khoja-Moolji, I wanted to say that your book has been my daily reference as I write my thesis. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Alhamdulillah.
I wanted to ask about the, so I was really moved by the quotation you share of Bibi Ashraf's mother being so sad when she's about to die and the pain that she feels on not being able to complete her daughter's schooling. And I found this really interesting because in my own work, I have found that there's often this discourse of paternal support against wider patriarchal disapproval of women's education. So the woman will say, my father wants me to study, my father has sent me to this school. And I just wondered if you had a sense of perhaps when that kind of discourse of gendered support and permission for women's education changed, and perhaps why you think that might have happened.
That's an interesting question. And I'll be honest, I haven't studied this in relation to the turn of the century text, but I will propose a response based on the current work that I'm doing with Shia Ismaili women who are recalling their own great-grandmothers' lives. And so we're talking about the same time period, but my evidence comes from oral histories and not the study of women's magazines, as you find in the book that you mentioned. And one of the interesting things I discovered is that by and large, we do find that once women are able to, the matriarchs of the family are able to make the connection that education will provide some sort of security to their daughters, they do they do offer support, but there are moments when they look for another authorizing agent. So it could be men from their families, but in the case of the Shia Ismaili women, for example, that I am studying currently, it was often the Shia imam. And so it was the imam at the turn of the century who would then intervene and instruct very like individual women that, yes, send your daughter to the midwifery course, or send your daughter to school and allow her to read more than the Quran, right? And so there is this sort of dynamic in place where women are increasingly at the turn of the century becoming aware about the possibilities that education might open for their daughters, but sometimes they need another sort of push. And often at this point, this is coming from men. But the notion that what might women do for women, what might education do for women, their daughters, they're still struggling. So I have evidence from the 1940s and 50s of women in East Pakistan, so 1950s, I guess, who do want their daughters to get an education, but until a certain degree, so not after 10th grade. And so expectations around what is acceptable for women within a community, what becomes a woman unmarriageable. So for example, does higher education make a woman unmarriageable within a particular biradari or caste formation, right? And so I think these are some of the concerns that I would explore more in terms of thinking about, even when women do offer support, what's kind of constraining them, because women are operating within their own social milieu, right? So they can't step out of it. And at what point are certain arguments about women's education being made to women are more accessible to them? Who are the authorizing agents? Who are they looking for permission from? In the case of Shia Ismailis, it was often the imam. And he established a girls' school in 1905 in Zanzibar for Ismaili girls. And so you're talking about even an institution. And so thinking of the symbolic work that an institution for girls does in 1905. And so then you can imagine, okay, this is a pivot in a way into their understandings as well. But this is an excellent question in terms of maternal support. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm really happy that you're doing this work. It's important.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for that question, and definitely sort of touched upon the crux of work that emerges of the argument that Professor Khoja-Moolji herself is making, but a number of other scholars are trying to kind of excavate with that time period, particularly with Muslim women's history. I can see that Sheila, who's also one of our co-organizers, has a question, so please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor
Hi,
Khoja-Moolji.
Sheila.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us as well. So I'm also sort of working on, maybe not the Shia Ismailis, but Muslim women's education for one of my chapters. And I look at architectural spaces and public and private spaces. So I'm sort of thinking in terms of the institution as a space and an often public space, but also education begins young. It also begins in the Zenana. So when it moves from the public to the private and the space of the school that young girls now begin to occupy, and since you spoke about, female solidarity, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what is it in terms of this reckoning of gender and sexuality, this young understanding of these complexities of identity, and how does that sort of formulate in the space of the school. And I'm working on Chuktai's Tedhi Lakir, where the school is an important presence, and where the narrator has this awakening of her understanding of identity and how education catapults that. So I was sort of hoping you could talk about, the bonds that girls form in the space of the school, in a very public space, but also in creating a private within that public space.
Such an excellent question, and your study sounds amazing. So I'll share why I thought this was why I thought that looking at the Zenana in Hayat-e Ashraf was interesting for me. So as I noted, at this time, and so since the late 19th century, we have a lot of arguments being proposed by British colonizers and even Muslim social reformers about how the Zenana is a space of corruption. And this is an ongoing argument, right? So you can also glean this in Afsane Najmabadi's book in relation to Iran as well. And so this ongoing argument, or even Fatma Mernisi's ideas that how the homosocial space in the imagination of the colonizer appears as this sort of black box, right? It's a black box, they cannot enter there. And so they imagine all kinds of corruptions and their fantasies are imposed onto this space. We also have a longer history of articulation where women from the Zenana seem to have had a domineering effect on male princes. And so in some cases, subverting the alliance of a Muslim male prince with the British as well. And so women, again, are seen as these corrupting influences that are in a way halting this expansion of British empire that is desired by the colonizer. And so we see a lot of these negative portrayals of the Zenana. And one of the things that happens, and other scholars have talked about this as well, is that then Muslim self-articulation about the Zenana takes on these tropes as well, right? And so the ulama, for example, are also then using the same interpretive lenses that are being made available to them by the colonizers to then interpret Muslim women's homosocial spaces. And hence this space becomes a site of reform, scrutiny, a dismantlement over the following century. And so my interest really has been in not saying that we need to completely dismantle the other private space, the other public spaces that emerged as a result or in tandem, but to then in a way reframe the narrative as well. Women's homosocial spaces also provided a lot of support. Women, even though they interacted with each other within a hierarchy of social class, even within that hierarchy, women have provided each other support. The exposure that younger women had to marsias or ginans or other literary oral traditions, and then that inspired them to actually do the reading and writing. I'm sure a lot of our own parents can recount some of these, or grandmothers, mashallah, if they're alive, they can recount some of these women-only spaces. And so I think one of the goals would be to kind of talk a little bit about how these spaces can also be empowering, and the fact that their narrowing and dismantlement within religious communities or outside in spaces has some sort of negative effect as well. But that doesn't mean that we should also abandon the other spaces, the space of the school, for example. Entrance in public domains inevitably increases the encounter that women have with others, right? And so it also offers a sense of freedom away from the disciplining eye of the mother, away from the disciplining eye of the grandmother, right? And so there are all of those tropes that are also really important. And so perhaps the idea is to multiply the spaces where women can experience their lives, their educative trajectories, and women-only spaces, as well as public spaces. I think just having more spaces would be so just so great for us. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your answer to that, Professor Khoja-Moolji. I was thinking actually, you know, when you were talking about how the Zanana is kind of seen as a corrupting site at sort of the middle to turn of the 19th century. Paul, I'm sure you're already aware of this, but in case people in the audience are interested, both Sheila and I have struggled a bit, but also gained a lot from Faisal Devji's essay on that and also maybe Gail Minot's work could be an interesting point of entry as well into that construction of the Zanana and the changes that happen. Speaking of the Zanana, I had a question as well, but let me just check the chat because I think something's come up there. Okay, yeah, well, so Shahana Munazir, who also just presented a fantastic paper in the panel that I was tech support for previously on Gharelu women in Bihar, is asking, thank you, Professor, for your fascinating talk. I had a question about the politics of the archive and the absence of Muslim women's voices within the archive in general in South Asia. I'm thinking about Saidia Hartman's work on the invisibility of Black women in archives. Could you speak a bit about how we reconcile the absence of everyday Muslim everyday voices of Muslim women, particularly that of marginalized women in the archives, or whether you felt that there is an absence at all?
Thank you, Shahana. And absolutely, I think, so one of the things I noted earlier was that the women who were writing, so in my first book, talk about women's magazines, and the women who had those literals were precisely, right? And so in their work, we do see figures like the Aya who is working and who's doing all the chores for them. And so I write a little bit about those classed and gendered performances that emerge in their text, but these are largely elite women's worlds. And so so in my current text, the way I am trying to recover the lives of the women who we don't encounter is basically through oral history. But Hartman uses the method of critical fabulation, right? So she calls on us to engage in these speculative journeys where a photograph, a fragment of a line in a colonial document might encourage us to then do a historical discovery and then to imagine and create a life that is actually not there. And so these are perhaps at least two methods. I'm sure there are many more. Oral history becomes a method where we're actually talking to the descendants of most of these women. And so in my forthcoming book, I've talked to about 65 women and talked about their great grandmothers. And so that's one way in which memory work it helps us to give them a certain sort of fullness and bring them into presence. But then there are other women who are also like Muslim women novelists today, who are trying to write what they call a nonfiction memoir, but it's also in the form of a novel. And so they are doing the kind of work that Saidiya Hartman speaks about, where you have these memories, you have these fragments that come to us either from family conversations or from an album that's tucked away under the bed, stuffed in a suitcase. And so they are now trying to kind of venture into the kinds of life that women in the past had. And I think it's an urgent work, and it's work that we have to do because of the political stakes that this work has for us, right? It gives women like us a genealogy to have a history. And so I think as you are doing in your work, I think this is really important to kind of capture and materialize those absent lives.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could add to that, Sarah. So even, as you were pointing out, like as I do work amongst Muslim women within households and contemporary household spaces though, but I do have to historicize that a little bit, right? So I have to go back to see, what ordinary Muslim women back in the 19th and 20th century were doing in those, within domestic caregiving spaces, how were they catering to the family? Of course, we all know that it's a gendered household space, and we know from the literature on history and archive on Muslim women that, we can't expect the kind of empowerment and aspiration that we sort of, link with Muslim women in today. So, but I've always had this, this problem of where to find those documents and how to sort of go about looking for, as you said, ancestral documents could be one of those ways of looking, or even magazines that sort of speak about, ordinary women's lives. But we often encounter only Ashraf women, right? Within, at least in the Indian context, that's the kind of libraries that I'm going to be using. So I just wanted to sort of, this is like it for me to understand where should I even begin to sort of think about the invisibility of everyday lives of, especially in the case of like family caregiving and domestic space, and what were women doing in their everyday world, so that kind of that, which is why when you said critical fabulation and imagination, that's one part of it, of course, but then imagination, to what extent can we do that, or can we use that sort of methodology within South Asia?
I would imagine that I think it becomes increasingly hard to rely on the official archives. I think official archives have a limitation, right? So I think you might be able to, like the way I did, right? So I read the novels written by Ashraf women to then trace who are the other women that they're talking about, the women who work in their households.
Right.
You can also trace women who are offered for sexual comfort to elite men, right? So you can trace groups of women that Ashraf are encountering and then discover their lives, try to discover their lives to the extent possible. Colonial archives, for example, you will have household data. So in my current work, I have found East African household data of Asian settlers to be really helpful as well, because at minimum, that gives you a name. And so right. In some of my research, everybody remembers a male, the name of the male proprietor of a girls' boarding school, but nobody remembers the woman who actually probably did most of the work, right? And so for that, you go to the colonial household data, and they used to keep the names of women as well. And so then at least you found that name.
Right.
And then you can ask, okay, who was Mitibai, right? And so you might be able to get more information that way. But it's a tough task, you're right. And I think maybe the task for this generation of Muslim women's writers like yourselves would be to make critical fabulation an acceptable academic practice, because we too are trying to write the lives of women, of course, not those who were enslaved in the ways in which Saidiya Hartman speaks about, but also women who did not make it into the archive. And so I think we too have to figure out alternate ways and to make these methodologies acceptable. And that too is a feminist practice, right?
Yeah. I just didn't want to fall into this pitfall of sort of uncritically importing an idea which was, of course, written for a different setting, a different kind of oppression that went around with Black women in the United States. And so I just want, it's really helpful. Thank you so much.
But I'd also say one thing. I think Saidiya Hartman has named her method And she's,
Right.
of course, a big name. But if you go back and read novels that are written by Muslim women, they're doing pretty much the same thing. So Taslim, I forget her last name. Oh my gosh, she's gonna kill me. There are novels that are written by Muslim women, and I think we haven't kind of made that interpretive lens or named what they're doing, but they have been doing this sort of imaginative creative work in their text as well. And so I think maybe you can give it a different name, but these practices, humans try to do pretty much the same things.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, Professor. That was very helpful.
I was just thinking, like, I mean, obviously this is famous and infamous, but I mean, there are obviously clear connections that can be drawn to Spivak's sort of account of her great grandmother and the great aunt or whoever who sort of killed herself, and then her kind of trying to link that fact and figuring out what possibly the reasons could be and tracing that history. And of course, this is a Brahmin upper caste Bengali woman, but still obviously oppressed in a different way, which is maybe some sort of precursor to a certain kind of critical fabulation, possibly to, or maybe a connection there. But I had two questions because, I mean, obviously on this question of Sharafat and sort of thinking about the lives of working class Muslim women, lower class Muslim women, in contrast to Ashraf Muslim women who are sort of somewhat more accessible, even if not completely always accessible in the archive. I was curious also as to think about, and a lot of scholarship and discourse online particularly has been emerging about caste in Muslims in the last couple of years, and very important work is being done by a number of scholars in that field now. And I was curious to sort of find out from you, because as we can see that, and I think it was Pranay Sood in the conference, like his symposium, his paper kind of also in sort of dealt with that, but possibly the notion of Sharafat as caste versus an aspirational class identity. So from foreign born to, you can be Sharif by doing Sharif things. How do you see that tension between caste and class kind of play out, particularly at this historical moment that you are examining? And how do you see the definition of Sharafat to expand itself to include previously excluded groups of Ajlaf and Arzal Muslims, and particularly maybe if there's scope for you to link it again to gender, and Muslim women in particular, if you see that connection panning out in your research, especially now with your new book, maybe particularly because you're looking at oral histories, if you see that somewhere emerging.
So I think, so that's a very interesting question, because I also was fascinated to see how a category primarily linked to ethnicity and court privileges was being reframed in real time, just because of the social and economic pressures that Muslims were experiencing, and what that meant in terms of expanding it to include the upwardly mobile, professionalized folks, and how particular performances, sartorial practices, for example, become part of that umbrella. And so I think in that sense, one could argue that there is an expansion, and it makes allowances for other social classes of people or castes of people to be part of this category. But what I've also discovered is that, and of course, people here already know, since the colonizers wanted to have clarity about religious practices in the ways in which they define their Protestant faith, there was an imposition or a context within which one had to define oneself as either Muslim or Hindu, right? And so the notion that drop your liminal practices, drop your synthetic shared tradition, and tell me if you are a Hindu or a Muslim, that pressure, I also in my current research have felt was really felt strongly by women and their own communities as well. And so if you're living in an environment where you have to continually try to figure out what my religious affiliation is, and you're threads to each other that were based on ethnicity are becoming looser, because now you're trying to establish connections with others based on religious relationality. I think there is a moment of 150 years over which this happens, but this is what happens in relation to at least Muslim women, where they stop seeing themselves primarily in terms of their caste, like the Khoja caste, for example, and they become, okay, I am a Shia Muslim and I'm part of a Shia Muslim Jamaat in which multiple people from cross class and cross sort of nations can be a part of. And so this shift doesn't happen automatically, but I want us to think about the fact that with the entrenchment of British rule, there is a moment where, at least in, and I haven't studied the other side, I haven't studied Hindu self-articulation, but at least Muslim self-articulations of the people that I'm concerned with, it does, there's something that's happening in relation to amplifying the religious identity. And this doesn't mean that caste practices evaporate, and endogamy, for example, stays salient. You have institutional leaders that are elected by a caste, they continue to have the same kind of power, right? So it's not a complete sort of rupture, but you do see other relationalities. And whenever a new relationality is built, something is going to get usurped. Like this is, I think Lauren Berlant has said that every form of intimacy also requires a certain sense of sort of, it replaces something. And so I think we have to also then think about, okay, if we're speaking about Muslim relationalities, then there's something else that's going on in relation to caste relationalities as well. And what is that something? And so for me, that's been the question in terms of tracing this.
That's fascinating, and no, that's so, yeah, clearly articulated and so thoughtfully as well. I mean, quickly, I just wanted to add, in case this interests someone, I was listening to Sabah Divan's interview. She wrote Tawaif Nama, which is this sort of history of Tawaifs as, in some ways, she looks at, it's also kind of like a reimagined history. So she speaks to contemporary Tawaifs in Banaras and I think North Bihar, so near Sivan, etc., and talks to them about their mother, their great grandmother, their grandmother, and what their lives could have been, and kind of mixes some fiction with history, I think, possibly. And I think that she said something very interesting in that interview, where she said that for a lot of Tawaifs who kind of then by that time are classed as a caste identity almost in the colonial archive, they have to suddenly explain their religion, and because they have descended very often from men with with ambiguous sort of patrilineal sort of lineage, they're forced to kind of so they often like enter Muhammadan Hindu hyphen Hindu, or Muhammadan mix in the archive itself, and then they're forced to, with the second census, kind of pick Hindu Tawaif or Muslim Tawaif. And I think that's quite interesting in the context that you're talking about. And the documentary is also very interesting. It's called The Other Song, in case someone wants to watch it on YouTube. But I will stop recommending things to go off on. This has been, I have so many more questions, Professor, but I feel like it would just take the entire evening, and I would just keep going on and on and on. And all of you have already been so patient with your time, but it's been absolutely fabulous having you, Professor, and we're so grateful that you've managed to take out the time, and you've so thoughtfully, and so I must add, clearly and in a very jargon-free way, engaged with really complicated questions and given us so much food for thought. So it really felt almost like I was sitting in a classroom and learning from you, which is, I guess, the beauty of, in some ways, of these online connections that we can establish. But yeah, unless there are any further questions, I'm very very happy to kind of lend the floor. I'm forgetting things. To Fatima, who can do the closing now, I think.
Hi. Thank you so much, Professor Khoja-Moolji. That was incredible. I loved listening to it. I'm so glad that we got to have you here with us and to have you close and have all those really cool connections come up when you were talking about all these people who've actually been attending across the weekend with us as well. So that was really, really lovely. Thank you so much. Zehra's given me the job of closing first, but I don't think I was supposed to. Sheila, I think you go before me.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Clearly, I have forgotten the script.
It's been a very long weekend. Please forgive us. But anyway, thank you once again to all our panelists. And I'm aware that Fatima is going to do the official vote of thanks. But personally, I want to say that this has been a very enriching experience for me, a learning experience, getting to chair, these incredible panels. And I really hope that you've all sort of taken something away from this 3-day symposium. I certainly have, and there's a lot that I'm gonna take back and sort of put into my thesis and rework my thesis in a very crucial manner, which is exactly what we were sort of hoping, for this symposium of incredible people working on something that is at once the same and also vastly different in highlighting experiences and identities. Just to point out certain things that, we've gotten a lot of requests, for recordings. And as you all know, we have been recording a lot of the talks other than the ones that speakers didn't want to be recorded. And we will be making those available very soon because we are aware that a lot of people missed out on, a panel which was running parallel. And we're going to be posting all of this to our YouTube channel and also embedding it on our website. I'm just going to post the link to the YouTube channel. Yes, exactly. I will be doing that just now. So please go and subscribe just so that you know when it's uploaded, because we're not going to take a lot of time. We're going to upload in a day or two. So that way and we're going to publicize it as much as we can. So keep a lookout on that. And we are in talks with multiple journals because we would really like to bring an edited issue, a special issue out of, the findings and the research from the symposium. So again, everything is sort of preliminary on that front at this moment, but we'll update you as and when we have more information. And if you have any, contacts that you'd like to put us through with, please also email us. And yeah, that's sort of the updates that we have. And finally, this symposium was always supposed to be a precursor to a larger in-person event that we would like to do, a proper conference, although this turned out to be quite a conference in its own right. But not to take away from the fact that, online conferences have always been more accessible, and we appreciate that and realize that, and we will try and administer this hybrid element going forward as well, as much as we possibly can. But thank you. But we do want to do some sort of an in-person just so that we can come together as a community. That's something that we're planning for now. And again, we would appreciate your support and help in that. We would really like your feedback as well, from the symposium. So kindly write to us, to our emails with any feedback that you might have that we can take on board for our future endeavors. Apart from that, I'm just gonna hand over the virtual mic to Fatima as she does the vote of thanks.
Thanks for that. Now my voice is going. Thanks for that, Sheila. So really quickly, I don't want to keep everyone too long, but we have so many incredible people who have really helped us, and we really need to thank them. So first of all, thank you to everyone for your presentations. Apologies for any technical glitches. I don't think there was much chaos, but Zoom is always difficult to kind of navigate against. Running parallel sessions is really difficult, but everyone was very nice, very patient, and we really appreciate it. Thank you especially to our keynote speakers, Professor Tahira Naqvi, Professor Athar Zia, Professor Sylvia Vartuk, and of course, Professor Shenila Khoja. Thank you so much. Again, we've had everyone that we reached out to was so generous with their time, which was why this kind of turned into a 3-day event, because everyone we reached out to said yes, which was something that we were not expecting, but just goes to show that the academic community is very supportive, very generous. So the future is good for all of us, I think, who work on this. Thank you to all our other presenters on every single panel. If I could say all of your names and thank you each individually, I really, really would, but I think everyone wants to go to bed. Thank you also to our personal supervisors, myself, Zehra, and Sheila's, Anindya, Michelle, Floria, and Ranita. They are obviously, guiding us across our own academic journeys, and they've been very, very supportive. Personally, my supervisors have been great. I don't think many would tolerate me doing this on a weekend when I'm supposed to be submitting my thesis soon. So that was really great. Professor Nandini Chatterjee, who was the director of the South Asia Center at Exeter, has been really, really fabulous. She's also been attending so many of these sessions across the weekend. So thank you to Nandini as well.
And tweeting memories.
Yes. So yeah, no, everyone's been great. Thank you to Rhea Emma. Thank you to Elena Romero Pasarin, who both have helped us with design, with tech. We've been very grateful. Speaking of tech, the ghost of the Tasavvur account that you have been seeing across the weekend was populated sometimes by us, but mostly by two people who are also speakers at the event, Stuti and Neha. Thank you so much to both of you for doing that. We really, really appreciate it. Like I said, everyone has been so supportive. So we are so grateful that we have such amazing friends who are willing to step up and do this for us. Also, shout out to Zoom and Hannah Siddiqui at Zoom, who tolerated a lot of my very, very long voice notes while I was asking her how to work this. You've been great, Hannah. Thank you. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining. My script also says, and I'm going to end on this, thank you Allah for making Muslim women. And on that note, thank you everyone and goodbye. And we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. Have a good night.
Good night,
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Can't believe you read that out. That was for us.
It's great. I think we can stop recording now, possibly.
Oh, yeah.
Neha, please stop.